Street Fighter Collection 2 is a 1998 release for the Sony PlayStation comprising 3 classic Street Fighter games. The original Street Fighter II The World Warrior, Street Fighter II Champion Edition, and Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting. Funny how the second collection of Street Fighter games on the PlayStation would feature the earliest iterations of the perennial fighter, coming a year after a solid Street Fighter collection comprising the more refined versions of Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter Alpha 2. Street Fighter Collection 2 is actually a localization of Capcom Generations 5, the 5th entry in a series of Capcom compilation packs that were released for PlayStation exclusively in Japanese markets. These collections would eventually be compiled together and released under the Capcom Classics Collections disc for PlayStation 2 and Xbox, complete with extras. So if you have that collection on hand after all these years, Street Fighter Collection 2 might feel a bit superfluous, but we'll forget about that later compilation, and we'll also forget about the 30th anniversary collection that's more recent and more emulation based, I guess, but whatever. Anyway, you've got 3 flavors of Street Fighter 2 in this here Street Fighter Collection 2, starting with Street Fighter 2, The World Warrior, the original, the one that started it all and gave us Guile handcuffs for 5 seconds, and that stopped being a thing for some reason. Then you have Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition. Play as the 4 Grandmasters for the first time, partake in matches between 2 of the same fighter, and enjoy the slightly nicer looking mugshots. And then finally we've got Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting. More speed, more color palettes, new moves using pre-existing assets and tweaks and stuff. For some people, probably the only reason to get this disc back in the day is for a quality version of Hyper Fighting that isn't relegated to a lesser port on the Super Nintendo, the Sega Mega Drive, or some mediocre computer conversion. Each of these games have the same 3 modes of play: the traditional arcade, 2-player versus, and training modes. As you beat the arcade mode, you'll unlock a CPU battle mode, a single battle against a computer opponent of your choice at the highest difficulty setting, an alternate soundtrack taken from certain Street Fighter 2 ports such as the 3DO or FM Towns, and a deluxe versus mode, where you and a buddy can mix and match different versions of different characters and such. So Champion Edition Ryu versus Hyper Fighting Ken, for example, is a thing you could do. This deluxe versus mode would eventually become the basis for Hyper Street Fighter 2, a tweaked version of Super Turbo with a similar concept in mind. In addition to the 3 games, there's some additional collections for you to preview, some gallery artworks and profiles, and pro tips on how to beat the game and such. With regards to this PlayStation version, you're getting a fair approximation of the arcade Street Fighter 2s. The graphical detail, the sprite animation, the typeface for certain aspects of the headset display is almost on par with the arcade originals. Control for the most part is fairly functional, even with the PlayStation D-pad thing, which I never liked, but it works well enough, I suppose. A missed move or 2 here or there on occasion, but nothing too serious. Regards to the soundtrack, you've got the original CPS-1 based arcade music, plays pretty crisp for the most part, and while the remix tracks are a nice addition, I've never been a fan of these, to be honest with you. They sound fine, they're nice tunes, but I always preferred the original tracks as is, but to each their own, I suppose. It's not a perfect package, however. There are some minor abnormalities here and there. The announcer calls seem a bit quick, particularly during the end of a match.
You win!
The load times, as expected, are there, but they're not as bad as the usual PlayStation fighting fare. Honestly, I think the load times go by rather quickly in this game. They're still kind of there, they still take a couple seconds, but I've played other PlayStation games where loading takes a lot longer, so that's not so bad here. I mean, there's some really minor things that otherwise doesn't detract from an otherwise sublime package for its day, but they're noticeable little abnormalities if you really pay attention, and that's rarely an issue that pops up. Regardless, Street Fighter Collection 2 is a fine package indeed, and for the time a collection of games that lacks the bells and whistles of later fighters, but holds up exceptionally well even today. Even with all these lavish and technically sound fighters available on the market, a small group of buddies would get together, fire up the old Street Fighter 2 and have a ball of a time. Because at the end of the day, these games are still fun. 1998 with this here collection, and even in 2020 where they can be played on a variety of formats. And with that in mind, is this Street Fighter Collection 2 disc for PlayStation 1 worth a pickup? I suppose it depends. Hardcore Street Fighter or a PS1 enthusiasts would probably want to add this to the pile if they don't already have it, despite its high asking price these days. For some folks, the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection on current platforms, or hell, even the Capcom Classics Collection discs from a couple generations prior, would be entirely sufficient. Hell, there's a contingent of folks who would rather play the games on the old 16-bit systems, which is strange to hear, but actually true. I know some of those folks. But for what it's worth, Street Fighter Collection 2 does the task of bringing classic Street Fighter 2 action over to the PlayStation and gives those early games the treatment that they deserve.